Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very happy to bring the conversation I had with Lloyd Llewellyn-Jones. Lloyd is chair and professor of ancient history at Cardiff University. He has his PhD in ancient history from Cardiff University and has taught previously at the University of Edinburgh. His main interests are in Greek socio-cultural history, women's history, and ancient Persia. He's the author of many books, including the most recent, The Cleopatras, the Forgotten Queens of Egypt. I was turned on to Lloyd's work when he had his previous one on Persia, on the Persians. A fabulous book. I saw he had a new one out on the Cleopatras and kind of immediately dived right into it and really enjoyed it. That's what we talk about in this conversation. We talk about the 7 major Cleopatras. Now, as I said in the conversation, I didn't know there was more than one Cleopatra. When I think of Cleopatra, I think of, the Cleopatra, stuff that people have made movies and shows and documentaries on. But there were many Cleopatras over a period of time. So we talk about the 7 major Cleopatras. I should note the one that people most think of, the one that, Liz Taylor is in the movie and many other characterizations, is the 7th, Cleopatra the 7th. So it was really interesting reading his book, getting all the historical accounts of everyone before her. We talk about gender roles and norms in Egypt and what that was like. We talk about sort of the background and context, such as the Ptolemies. We talk about Cleopatra I, who, if I'm not mistaken, was from Syria originally. So it's really interesting to think about. Obviously, nation states now don't really make as much sense, 4,000 years ago. But it is interesting to think about the Cleopatras being from different parts of the world, not just Egypt. We talk about incestuous marriages, which were pretty common. And there were, in some places, a kind of a tough read for modern eyes to read about. We talk about Potbelly. This is the sort of the nickname for one of the rulers, and his dynamics with Cleopatra II and Cleopatra III. We talk about the ethnicity of Cleopatra VII and why many people make a big deal about that. Her various romantic relationships, her suicide, legacy of the Cleopatras, and many other topics. Again, this was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed this conversation. Learned so much. Again, not even just the fact that there are multiple Cleopatras, but one of the great things that Lloyd does is that he really does have a balance of looking at gender roles and norms in ancient history and what that means for us today. So it's all very good stuff. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergentdialogues.substack.com, also on YouTube. So like, subscribe, share with your friends, and I bring you Lloyd Llewellyn-Jones. I am here with the wonderful Lloyd Llewellyn-Jones. Lloyd, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm greatly looking forward to speaking with you.
It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Certainly. So you've previously I had read your book Persians, which is fabulous. It's a great book. Everyone should check that out. And more recently, over the past couple months, you have the next one in the queue, which is The Cleopatras, the Forgotten Queens of Egypt.
Oh, that's right.
And it is a fantastic book. And as I was just telling you, I learned a heck of a lot. There was a handful of things I knew about Cleopatra. I didn't even know there were multiple Cleopatras, as I'm sure a lot of people don't. And so yeah, I learned a whole bunch, and it was quite the ride reading the book. It was really great. So I'm excited to talk all about it. Before we do, just tell listeners who you are professionally, academically, and what you're currently up to.
Okay, so I'm the professor of ancient history at Cardiff University here in Wales. My specialities really are on the ancient Near East, so Babylon, Assyria, Persia, but also I'm really interested in the wider Greek world, and in particular about sort of cultural interactions in antiquity. No society was ever particularly an island, and they all interacted in various ways. And I'm always fascinated by those kind of nodes of interaction. I remember once there was a really great classicist called Martin West, and he likened culture to gas, so that like, these kind of like nodes of gases, as you think of them coming out from the ground, and where that gas is, of course, that's where culture is strongest. But gas is immovable, okay, so it works its way around the world, and then inevitably it will interact with another node of gas and mix and merge, and it's that mixture and merging really of ancient societies that I'm particularly interested in, and of course it's so relevant in our world today, isn't it? That we can't see each other as being separate from anything else. We're all part of this nexus of interaction. And I think the more we think about history in global terms, and especially ancient history in global terms, the happier I become.
I think that's right. I mean, I think one of the things in just a casual reading of history is that people, I think rightfully so, emphasize, multiculturalism, diversity, all these things in our modern times. But that's always been going on
Always been
for all of time. And really, I mean, you look at all the big empires, you look at all of the pieces of there's certain points, as you were saying, that are more than others, as it is today too. But I mean, in some ways, before it was very diverse. It was very eclectic. It's really interesting.
People really traveled in antiquity. I mean, they really got around. We kind of think of the world in antiquity as being these kind of separate states, but really people traverse the world as much as we do today. There's nothing new about global travel in a way. It's just that we can do it quicker, that's all.
That's right. Yeah. No, I totally agree. There's something in us. There's something in the Homo species. Whenever Homo erectus got out of Africa and started walking around, it just
walking and keep on walking.
Just set us on course, and now we continue to walk and swim and fly and drive.
That's exactly
and so
it. Absolutely.
This is very, very fascinating. So the Cleopatras. So I didn't know there were at least 7, as you detail in the book. Why don't people know this? So you mentioned in the book in the beginning, I think, about some people have seen the Elizabeth Taylor. I've seen that movie. It's a very long 4+ hour movie. It's a good movie, but Cleopatra played by Elizabeth Taylor, and that I think she's the 7th in that
That's
film.
What she's the last. She's the final.
Yeah. But there was so many before her.
Yeah.
How do we not know this? Why do not a lot of popular people know it?
Yeah. I think it's because Cleopatra VII, the Liz Taylor Cleopatra VII, has dominated the whole screen, really. We don't need the others. Because Cleopatra VII, was already the subject of a kind of huge propaganda machine in her own lifetime, in the world of the Romans, of course, who were her enemies. They created this image of the great femme fatale at that point, this viperous Egyptian vampire kind of figure, sapping the energy out of Roman men. And then after her suicide, essentially every age in Western history has taken Cleopatra and molded her into something they wanted her to be. In the Middle Ages, Chaucer was writing about her. Shakespeare wrote about her, as this kind of gypsy queen of the Nile, the serpent of old Nile. George Bernard Shaw wrote about her. Then we've got Cecil B. DeMille, we've got Mankiewicz and Liz Taylor. Recently, she's been claimed by Black Lives Matter. She's been claimed by the Me Too movement. So we are wanting to project every society onto this figure of Cleopatra. She's become so flexible. And I think because of that, we've taken her out of history to a great extent. She stands alone, really, so that we can make her anything we want. Now, there are other people who do that, have had that done to them in history as well. Alexander the Great is a good example of that as well. What we actually know historically about Alexander the Great, you can virtually write on the back of a matchbox. There's so little, but that hasn't stopped us projecting onto him either. And I think because of that, because we've taken her out of her historical context, in one way, she's survived the ages. Her name has, gone down the centuries. But in another way, we've done her a disservice because a fascinating woman she undoubtedly was. She is so much more fascinating when we put her back in her historical context. And especially when we realize that she was one of this whole family of women, 7 ruling queens called Cleopatra, plus a whole lot of other Cleopatras who were part of the family as well, all of whom were major, I mean, real major political players in a world which was completely patriarchal. I mean, they stand out as being very, very able, capable, brilliant women. So it's a great shame, really, because of this, projection of Cleopatra as a kind of every woman for every era, that in fact we've forgotten her legacy and really forgotten the females that surrounded her. So I wanted to sort of just get them back on the radar, really, and get people to realize, look, if we want to take women's history seriously and look at a feminist approach to history, and I'm certainly a feminist writer, then, we've got to do these kind of women a service, because these are not women who are also rans. They didn't pay lip service to power. They actually were politically, socially, and culturally movers and shakers.
Yeah, maybe just set the table for us a little bit on this piece about, just how, for all of them in different ways, obviously they're different women. How much did gender roles and norms of the time, and, obviously this is through decades, kind of impact the kind of empires and the environment and, the other people they were ruling with? How much of that, to have a powerful female figure, was it at this time, was really, really essential or really important? Like, what do we see from that piece?
Well, it was quite extraordinary, really, that these women could garnish power for themselves and rule in the ways they did. Now, I'm not ever downplaying women's power within any historical society. And I think that nowadays we tend to call this soft power, and I like that term because it's a kind of power that isn't official. There's no name for these women, as in terms of government or anything. They're simply the wife of or the daughter of somebody, and I think that's always been going on. This kind of influence and politicking that women can do behind the scenes, as it were. But what's remarkable about this period in history for the Cleopatras, and basically we're talking about 150 years from the middle of the 2nd century BCE to the close of the 1st century BCE, 30 BCE, when these women no longer sat in the shadows and maneuvered and operated power behind the scenes. They actually came forward and were the principal political players in the world of international diplomacy and warfare at that time. I've not really come across in previous societies earlier than the Cleopatras anything where women have that visible aspect of power and leadership. Now, in Egypt, if we think back in the pharaonic period, there had been women who had stepped out of the shadow, women like Hatshepsut, this famous female ruler who kind of ruled like a man and represented herself almost in a male guise. The Cleopatras didn't do that. They were aware of their female selves and represent themselves as females, and yet they managed to claim a kind of power that was equal only to kings. And I think part of the reason why these women could do it in an Egyptian context is because throughout Egypt's long history, and let's remember here, okay, that the Cleopatras were closer to the time in which the Eiffel Tower was built than the time in which the Great Pyramid was built. Okay, Egypt was already 3,000 years old by the time the Cleopatras are on the scene. The Egyptians had always had this kind of duality principle. Egypt was always about dualism, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, the Nile Valley and the desert, and so forth. So there was always meant to be a male principle and a female principle. And the Egyptians believed in their theology that the world worked best, the cosmos worked effectively, when there was a male pharaoh on the throne, but with a female principle, a wife or a mother or a daughter sitting next to him. Because then there's this kind of, I suppose, yin and yang, okay? There's an energy that goes between the two of them. So there was always an official place in Egyptian royalty for a queen. That's an interesting thing in itself. So, for instance, in Assyria or Babylon or Persia, we don't have anything like that at all. Women do not get that sense of prominence. And this is why among Egyptologists, names like Nefertiri, Nefertari, Nefertiti, all of these greats, Queen T, they're known because women had a role in governance in that kind of way. So in a way, the Cleopatras maximized on that. But then they overstepped anything that even a pharaonic royal woman would do. And that's what makes them quite remarkable and why they need to be known.
Yeah, it's you're reminding me of a conversation I had with Rory Cox, who's up at St. Andrews, and he wrote a great book on the origins of the just war in the Near East.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. We talked a little bit about this. We talked to something about different timing in Egypt and different topic, but we did kind of sort of set the table of sorts of this idea of the theology, the cosmology that Egypt had for many, 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 many millennia. And you're just to this point that you're saying about this kind of duality that was going on, which is, this wasn't like a new thing. This is something that they did. And interesting where that kind of sits with other groups or populations or civilizations in the ancient Near East, which is really fascinating.
Really
to see that. It's very,
and I think if you think in the case of the Cleopatras, okay, I mean, their dynasty, the people that they came from were Macedonians, so they were Greek speakers. So Egypt had been invaded by Alexander the Great, and then afterwards he kind of left Egypt to Ptolemy I, one of his generals, and they established this 300-year long dynasty of Greeks in Egypt. Now, within a Greek-speaking world, women probably had the lowest status anywhere in antiquity. They couldn't own property, they couldn't divorce, they couldn't own money. So we have the kind of lowest point in women's existence in the ancient world. And yet out of that, because these Ptolemies allied themselves so completely with a theology of Egypt that was so ancient, because of that, these essentially Greek women could Egyptianize and become power brokers themselves. And I think that's really, really remarkable. Because really, we should just see a clash of civilizations here, where women, like queens, just have nothing to say, nothing to do. They're basically just baby bearers, and that would be it. But it doesn't work that way, because the Ptolemies, to give themselves an own sense of legitimacy as conquerors ruling Egypt, they harness Egyptian traditions, and they must have been influenced here and educated by Egyptian priests in particular, because the Ptolemies develop as a Greek dynasty a very subtle understanding of ancient Egyptian politics and the religious world of Egypt as well. So in due course, all Ptolemaic kings became living gods, as pharaohs had done before. Right. All Ptolemaic queens became living goddesses, as pharaonic queens had done. And moreover, the other thing that is really implemented in this dynasty is brother-sister marriage. Yeah. That, it kind of sounds really kind of awful to us. And in fact, anthropologists have said that, incest is the one consistent thing we have across societies, regardless of geography or chronology, where human beings have, and this is the term they use, the inbuilt yuck factor. That is just awful, And if anybody's seen Game of Thrones, I'm sure this is what we're building on, all right? But the Ptolemies, you see, they really harnessed the politics of incest. And really, from Ptolemy II right the way down to Cleopatra VII, every Ptolemy, where possible, married his sister or sometimes even daughter. And these incestuous relationships were not just, in name, they were physical relationships. And the intent was to beget children on your sister to rule the next generation. What's fascinating is there is, of course, a theological background to this. So among the Egyptians, in the Egyptian pantheon, there was Isis, the goddess Isis, who married her full brother Osiris and bore a child, Horus, by him. But equally for the Greeks, this was important because in the Greek pantheon, the god Zeus was also married to his sister, Hera, as well. So can you see in this kind of bilingual world that the Ptolemies were working in, they actually took these two theologies and merged them together, and then they acted them out in real life. So these living gods and goddesses were only doing what the deities of Egypt and Greece were doing anyway. And so that's how they justified what to us seems really quite bizarre and distasteful. For the Ptolemies and the Cleopatras, this was the apex of rulership.
Yes, it's a very interesting thing of as we were talking about, merging of cultures. There is at the very least a kind of full commitment to acculturation at the very least, and I would probably say assimilation, which is
absolutely.
It's quite a marvel at that time.
And that's really interesting because on one level it happens extremely well like that, but on another level in the Ptolemaic period in Egypt, there's a real clash of civilization as well. So, for instance, the Ptolemies, who were based in Alexandria, so right the way up in the north of Egypt, on the Nile Delta, looking out to the Mediterranean, they were essentially completely Greek. The city of Alexandria, one of the great cities in history, was a Greek-speaking city, as was most of the Nile Delta, which was being settled by Greek speakers from all over the Greek world. And in fact, the Ptolemies were paying people to settle in these areas, like pioneers, essentially. And what was happening in the first sort of 100 years of the Ptolemaic dynasty was that we find basically a sort of colonialist government emerging. And out of that, the Egyptians were always seen as second-class citizens. So the indigenous people were always pushed into the second class. Greek was the official bureaucratic language, always. The Greeks had far more tax relief than the Egyptians and all of this kind of thing. And that led to a lot of bad feeling. There were several revolts against the Greek presence in Egypt, especially in Upper Egypt, around Luxor, Aswan, the sort of traditional heartlands of Egypt. And it's really fascinating that none of the Ptolemies or the Cleopatras, apart from Cleopatra VII, the last one, ever spoke the Egyptian language. They only all spoke Greek, and so there's this. So at one point, you're absolutely right in saying there's this confluence, this synergy of cultures, but on another level, there is a sharp divide, an us and them mentality going on in Egypt at this point too.
So kind of give us the landscape here. You've done a little bit of it, but you're talking about in the beginning, there were these, in this region in the world, so Eastern Mediterranean and sort of kind of modern day Middle East for listeners, you have these three kingdoms that had the Hellenistic world. You had the Antigonids in Macedon, you had the Ptolemies in Egypt, as you mentioned, and the Seleucids in Syria, Levant, and Mesopotamia, so more east there. And so, what was the kind of big sort of players, if you will, in that landscape of who was doing what? This becomes important because of, as you mentioned earlier, there were the 7 Cleopatras, but there were other Cleopatras in different places as well. So tell us a kind of a regional, what was going on?
So by the time we get to the middle of the second century BCE, when the Cleopatras emerge as the queens of this dynasty, the two big political players in the Hellenistic world are the Ptolemies themselves, rooted in the Nile Valley, but also with properties in North Africa, Cyrene, sort of Libya, Algeria, that kind of area, and also dotted around the Aegean as well, like the island of Delos, for instance, was a Ptolemaic possession. But then you had the Seleucid Empire in the east, as you say, an area covering modern-day Israel, Palestine, up into Syria, Lebanon, across into Jordan, and at times running right the way to the border of Iran, across Mesopotamia. By this point in the first century, it shrunk a bit, but it was still a powerful player. And included in it was probably the most fertile area of the ancient world. Nowadays, we know it as the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, and that was always being fought over by the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. Getting control of that was really vital to them. And just as we have today, sadly, the area of the Levant in the Hellenistic period was a constant site of a theatre of war. I mean, it was being
Yeah.
played out there with regularity, constantly being played there, a tug of war between two thrones. And so what we find in this period is that the pharaohs of Egypt, the Ptolemies, and the Seleucid kings, the kings of this Seleucid kingdom, tend to be called Demetrius or Antiochus on the whole, they began to try to create some kind of harmony or rationality out of this period of chaos, of constant warfare, by employing an age-old tool of diplomacy, and that's diplomatic marriage. So we first hear that at the middle of the second century, the great king Antiochus III, one of probably the most famous and important of the Seleucid monarchs, he marries off his youngest daughter, Cleopatra, to the pharaoh of Egypt, Ptolemy V. She goes there completely unknown. She doesn't know about Egypt at all. She has to learn very quickly. But the Egyptians very soon embrace her. They like her very much, and they give her a nickname, Cleopatra I, so Cleopatra the Syrian, and she becomes the first Cleopatra of the dynasty. From there on in, right the way down to the last decade of the dynasty, there is a kind of interplay between these two royal houses, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, with brides being exchanged across the borders on regular intervals. So later on, Cleopatra Syra's granddaughters, three of them in fact, Ptolemaic princesses, each one of them, all called Cleopatra of course, they are shipped back to Syria to marry kings of the Seleucid dynasty as well. So there is this constant traffic in brides. It means that essentially by the end of our period, by the time of Cleopatra VII's death, the Seleucid and the Ptolemaic houses have essentially become one. You know, you can't put a credit card between them, as it were. You know, their line is so tightly drawn together. The other big player that I need to mention, though, that comes in around the middle of the second century and remains, is Rome, of course. Rome, at that point, during the time of Antiochus III, was still a sort of part player, a bit player in this great drama, but its power was increasing. And of course, Rome is one of the most warlike societies history has ever seen. And it quickly began to spread its domains into the Eastern Mediterranean, taking, first of all, of course, the territories of Old Macedonia, so, you know, the kingdoms of Alexander the Great himself and his successors disappeared, and then swooping down into Syria too. In 80 BCE, the Seleucid state fell to the Romans. Pompey the Great took those. The North African coastline also began to fall to the Romans as well, which meant that by the time we get to the middle of the first century BCE, Egypt finds itself in a very uncomfortable position with having Rome as its neighbor, both on its eastern and its western side. And of course, that can't be ignored. So it's Rome really that becomes the big player with Egypt in the last decades of the Ptolemaic household. And of course, the story of Cleopatra VII is so embedded in Rome that we really begin to see that very clearly.
So this sort of is interesting. I mean, it will come up in different ways, but you know, I don't know how important it is. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But so Cleopatra I is known as the Syrian. You know, I mean, you know, what does it mean to be Syrian, both historically and in at present time? You know, that's the question, right? That's a tough question in some ways.
Absolutely.
But culturally and ethnically, she's not Egyptian.
No.
Would we say that she's Syrian? Like, you know, she's you know, from a certain. What do we know about that?
I don't think the Ptolemies or the Seleucid thought of themselves particularly as Greek, as Egyptian or Syrian. I think they saw themselves as Greek, really. So in a way, transferring from one dynasty to another was pretty easy. You know, Cleopatra Syra didn't need to learn a new language or anything like that.
Which is
you know, it's
Greek.
kind of like Habsburg princes and princesses. You know, whether you're in Austria or in Spain in the
You're Habsburg.
17th century, you know, you're exactly the same. So I think
Yeah,
that's the way in which they saw themselves. You
Mm,
know, yeah, the Habsburgs saw themselves as Habsburgs, not Spanish or
mm-hmm,
Austrian. And I think
mm-hmm,
that's what's going on in the royal houses of the Hellenistic period as well. Essentially, they're all Macedonians. You know,
mm-hmm,
much later, under Cleopatra VII again, you know, we get her adopting a title for herself, Philopator, which means the lover of her country or her fatherland. And then you begin to ask, well, what was Cleopatra's fatherland? Was it Macedon still? Well, I
mm-hmm,
think 150 years down the line, probably not. I think
mm,
then it's Egypt.
mm.
But I think in the early decades, you know, the first 120 years of the dynasty, I think that the Egyptian monarchs, the Ptolemies, saw themselves predominantly as Greco-Macedonian.
It's very interesting because that's not the idea we get from media or from other images. It's
Oh,
just like,
no.
it's very interesting. It's like, no, it's they are, at the very least, yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
Is kind
You
of
know,
Greek, it's
and you're
Greco-Roman.
absolutely right about the media thing. And I mean, again, you know, if we draw on Mankiewicz's 1962 Cleopatra, okay?
Right,
So we
right.
see Elizabeth Taylor, you know, always in these kind of gold lame Egyptian style
Right.
garments, right? Looking like she's just stepped off a temple relief in Egypt. But of course, her
Right.
daily garb and the daily garb of all Ptolemaic and Ptolemaic rulers would have been Greek style garments, you know, hemation and wraparound
Mm-hmm.
garments and this kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
The Ptolemies and the Cleopatras did use Egyptian dress, but only for sort of state ceremonies. It was costume, but not daily dress, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
we have to get out of our heads this whole idea that everybody was walking around like something on the set of the movie Cleopatra. It simply wasn't like that.
Right, that's right. So she marries Ptolemy the Fifth,
Yeah,
and fertility is like huge. It's a
yeah.
huge thing.
Biggest thing.
Again, it's not unique to this
No,
part of the world or this time, but it was very very a big deal. And
absolutely.
you know, talk about like how she acclimated and how she kind of made a stand for herself. She does have a child eventually, but then we really start to see the incestuous marriages and all that, and you can
That's
kind of
right. That's
explain
right.
that as well. So
So it's kind of interesting. You know, Ptolemy V marries Cleopatra the First because he doesn't have a sister of his own, and that's
mhm,
the only reason really he looks for a foreign bride. If he'd had a sister, he would have married her like everyone
mm,
else before him. Cleopatra the First really kind of has to readjust her life to this new court in Egypt, and she does it extremely well. She kind of courts and flatters the powerful brokers of politics in the Alexandrian court. She doesn't. She doesn't come in heavy with the fact that she's Seleucid or the daughter of Antiochus III. She plays all that down. She tries to assimilate herself into the court, and she does such a successful job of it that when her husband Ptolemy V dies, she actually becomes the regent of Egypt for about a year and a half.
mm,
That's because her children are still a little bit too young to rule independently. She has two boys, Ptolemy VI and Ptolemy VIII. Ptolemy VIII is always called Potbelly in the
mhm,
sources because he was enormously fat, and it's a great name. And she also has a daughter, Cleopatra II. And it's written into Cleopatra I's will that upon her death, it's inevitable that her son, Ptolemy VI, must marry his sister, Cleopatra II. And that's exactly what happens. So it shows that this woman had completely assimilated into the Ptolemaic system during the sort of 25 years that she was residing in Alexandria, essentially as the Queen of Egypt, of course, because she understood the importance of brother-sister marriage. And in fact, you know, she emphasizes it in her will. This is something that has to happen here. And once we get into that next generation of Cleopatra II and Ptolemy VI, really we don't lose the incestuous relationship right the way down until the death of Cleopatra VII. You know, every
mm,
generation of Ptolemies and Cleopatras then
mm.
re-endorsed that incestuous role.
Let me just land on her for a minute before we go to her children. I mean, how, I mean, she's sort of she's the first, right? She's the sort of the trendsetter, right? She's the one that's setting the tone here. I mean, how important was it that she was very much able to kind of acquiesce to what her husband wanted, new culture, knew all these things, but then she finds herself in leadership, ruling briefly after her husband dies. Maybe that was sort of more common back then, that people died young or whatever. You didn't, you die of illness or things like that. But you know, you're from another place, another land, if you will, and you're in a new place, and all of a sudden you're ruling, even if it is an intermittent, brief thing. I mean, what kind of symbolism do we pull from that? What kind of model do we pull from that? And I guess how does her tone, at least for the first couple of her child or grandchild, set the tone for how they governed as well as Cleopatra?
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. Well, I think that she is extremely reliable as a consort to Ptolemy V. She appears everywhere in the monuments alongside him, and her name is found constantly in the Greek, the Demotic, and the Egyptian sources next to Ptolemy V. So she works extremely well and very hard at being a good wife, a good consort, to the point that halfway through their marriage, she is awarded with a new title, and she is called the sister of the king. So even though she's not a blood relation, or not his sister, she gets this honorific, which kind of suggests that she is. So therefore, where she obviously had endeared herself enough to the king and to his court to be able to do this. And I think one thing that we get from Cleopatra the First that is played out by all the other Cleopatras is that they're all willing to play the long game. None of them act hastily. All of them look into the future and see that there is a way for them. They're not impulsive in the slightest. They really think about things. And I think a real credit to Cleopatra I is the fact that from that point on until the death of Cleopatra the Seventh, every queen of Egypt is called Cleopatra. And I don't think these are birth names. I think that's a throne name they take on.
Yeah.
That's how powerful that name was. She does set a role model. And certainly by the time we get to the end of the life of Cleopatra II, her daughter, that's become fixed. We even have actually a really lovely little papyrus document from the reign of Cleopatra III, and it's an older woman. She writes to her daughter. She's an Egyptian woman, actually. She writes to her daughter, who's just given birth to a little girl. And the woman says, oh, I hope you're doing well. Can't wait to see the little baby. I'm going to send you some things like a milk bottle to feed her with. And, make sure you do this, this, and this. Lots of good sort of grandmotherly advice. And she finishes the letter by saying, it would really please my heart if you call the little girl Cleopatra. That is after the queen. So, somehow her image had perforated down to the common folk in Egypt as well. And I think that's part of her appeal, that she seems to have been just a good queen consort.
Yeah, I mean, that's important. I mean, it's really important. And who would know that it would follow for many years after?
Yeah.
So you have her child, Cleopatra II, and she marries her brother Ptolemy VI.
Yeah.
And then the other brother, the affectionately known Potbelly, which you can tell us about that a little bit, because I think this is some folks might know this, that to be large, to be heavy in weight, was a sign of like royalty, and you had you were well fed, and you had luxury and all this.
Yeah. So we hear of this name Potbelly because this young man was enormous. I mean, he was morbidly obese. All the Ptolemies were really. I mean, they were a fat family. But this was a kind of like an image of what the Greeks called trufe, which means luxury, excess. In an ancient world where most people lived basically a subsistence lifestyle, that is to say, hand-to-mouth food, okay, enough to get you through to the next day. To be fat, to be well-fed, was a sign of great privilege. And the Ptolemies actually utilized this. The Ptolemies were kind of like the most vulgar Russian oligarchs, really. Okay, splashing the cash on everything they possibly could. They were vulgar in their spending, creating temples, palaces, more jewels, more ships, more whatever. And their own personas, their own bodies were part of that display of trufe, their display of wealth as well. So while the Romans found this really distasteful and they kind of criticized Potbelly for being a fat loser, in his own mind and in the eyes of his people, he was probably the most successful pharaoh of all because he was this enormous girth, but with it, of course, came all this kind of kudos of being powerful and magisterial as well. He's a really complex character. On the one hand, we know that he was a poet, that he was an academic. He was obsessed by Homer. He wrote treatises on the Homeric epics. He loved keeping lists of extraordinary things. He published several books. So he was a gourmet. But on the other hand, he was one of the most cruel figures from ancient history. I mean, he had almost a sort of psychopathic love of pain and murder and would utilize it whenever, basically whenever he could. He was in all ways the antithesis of his elder brother, Ptolemy VI, who was a very measured individual and certainly far more of a character in keeping with Cleopatra II, their sister. While Cleopatra II and Ptolemy VI were on the throne together, I think by and large things ran smoothly. But after Ptolemy VI's death, Cleopatra II, because she needed to retain her position, had no option but to marry her other brother. So she marries Potbelly as well. And this is when a lot of dynastic troubles are created, because simply they are not suited as a husband and wife, let alone as co-rulers whatsoever. Cleopatra, with her methodical ways of operating governance, Ptolemy, Potbelly, with his excesses of luxury and sex and food, but also of cruelty and corruption and so forth. So it was a disaster, really, for Egypt to put these two together. But it got far worse when Potbelly decided that Cleopatra II was getting too old to be his principal consort. Now, she had given her first husband, Ptolemy VI, 2 daughters and 3 sons. Most of them had either been married off or all the boys had by this period died. So she didn't have a son of her own by Ptolemy VI. But she did manage to get a son by Potbelly, and they called him Memphites. And at that time, Cleopatra II must have been pressing on towards 45, 50, which in antiquity was a good age. And Potbelly realized, I think, that, well, he's not going to have any more sons by her because her fertility was clearly, her time was running out. So he turned his attention elsewhere to get children. And his eyes fell upon none other than his niece come stepdaughter, Cleopatra III. So that is Cleopatra II's youngest daughter by her first marriage. So he marries her and he begets children on her as well. So we have this bizarre situation in the Alexandrian palace where Potbelly, the king, is married simultaneously to the mother and to the daughter, begetting children on both of them. And you can imagine, I mean, this did not make for happy families at all. I mean, the feeling, the rivalry between these two women, who had once been so close, grew to the point that it was going to split Egypt in half. And we get, from the period of the marriage to Cleopatra III, essentially a kind of endless struggle within the royal household for supremacy.
Yeah, you mentioned the incestuous kind of marriage before. I guess just expand on that a bit. I mean, was it something that was it a purity thing? Was it a kind of diplomatic thing? I mean, they were very focused on this. And, aside from the disgust factor, which, I had to kind of override when I was reading this, I said, okay, well, their initial, his niece, his daughter, his sisters, oh my goodness. Okay, but all right, I kind of had to override that and just kind of read it, and then okay, but you know, I mean, obviously, things are going to break down. I mean, when you talk about the three siblings, a sister and two brothers were trying to rule a region together. I mean, I don't think I could. I can barely order, a dinner with my own brother half the time. We was like, well, you do it this way. No, I don't want to go here.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? So,
yeah.
I mean, yeah. How do these dynamics like work for years and years and years? Like, was it like an agreement? Was it? I mean, how do we know how these things work?
And the thing is, they often didn't work, and that's in a way one of the reasons why the Cleopatras come into their own. Because it just so happens that the women of the dynasty seem to have more backbone, more steel in them than the men. Inevitably, all the pharaohs from Ptolemy V to Ptolemy XV, all of them were weaker than their female counterparts. And that's just a fact of history, it's just an accident of history even, we're not getting great men in this period. We're not getting able rulers, warlords in this period. We're getting able women instead. And so, the women sort of almost find a chink in the armor of this kind of bizarre lifestyle, and they run with it. The thing that we don't know, of course, is what was all of this inbreeding doing to the bodies and the minds of the Ptolemies? Now, unfortunately, we don't have any archaeological evidence for them. The only remains we have are some bones of a young woman that was found in Ephesus, in a tomb in Ephesus, who was probably Arsinoe the fourth, and that's the younger sister of Cleopatra VII. But she's the only Ptolemy we have. So we can't tell really what was happening to their bodies or their minds. But if we look at, the records of other dynasties that have employed incest to a high degree, and I refer again now to the Habsburgs, for instance, and while they didn't marry brother and sister, they were frequently, in every generation, marrying nephew and niece, for instance. That was the most common compound. We know that by the time we get to Carlos II of Spain, I mean, the poor man could not function physically or mentally at all. And, that's with a lesser degree of incest than the Ptolemies were undertaking. So we might be prepared to say that the gene that really sort of created weak men could have been passed through the bloodline in that way, like a kind of hemophilia almost. But the women were kind of avoiding it. The women all seem to have been sharp. That's the incredible thing. Intelligent, focused and rooted. The men seem to have been complete messes in contrast. There's a lot of work that needs to be done still on dynastic incest and health and mental ability. The same thing is being undertaken by Egyptologists looking at the 18th dynasty, for instance, where we know once again there was a high level of incest at points in the 18th dynasty, not always, and again in the Ramesside period as well. But we need to do a lot more on dynastic marriage, interdynastic marriage, incest, and then health.
It's an interesting thing because I wonder if there are other dynasties where that doesn't occur. So did that occur in the Mongol Empire, the Ottoman Empire, certain Chinese dynasties? I don't know. I mean, I obviously...
By and large, I think in most dynastic contexts, the brother-sister relationship thing can still be there, but the bloodline can be softened by the fact that kings can take consorts from outside the royal family, very often did, and increasingly, of course, with the use of concubines as well. So, girls from all over an empire can be, gathered together and can become sexual partners of a monarch, and their children have, on the whole, rights to the throne as well. So that kind of thing gets watered down in many of these huge dynastic empires. But those who just look inward all the time, like the Ptolemies, and like the Habsburgs, are really fated, I think, with the same ending each time. But you're right. I mean, it would be good to take a really good long durée across history look at this kind of work.
Mm. Yeah, I want to know which publishing house is going to publish a book on incestual.
I know.
That's a tough sell.
I've just signed a contract to do to write a book on the harem in the ancient world.
Very
the
cool.
kind of power of women throughout antiquity, and obviously this is going to have to be something that I'm going to consider in it. So watch this space. I'll be doing something.
Yeah, that's a task. That's a task.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. There's all this movement. It kind of to the first point you said earlier between the two kind of regions, the Ptolemies and the other region. Is there that you talk about in the book where Cleopatra III, when she's married to Potbelly, they go away in exile, and you have this reign of Cleopatra II, kind of alone in Egypt.
Yeah.
And it's like this kind of splintering. It was just bound to happen.
Yeah.
But then there's a kind of a revenge story, and then she flies to Syria and meets up with another Cleopatra. It's a very interesting dynamic here.
Absolutely. And one of the players in this story, is the Alexandrian mob. They almost do work as a character. I'm always reminded of, like, in The Simpsons, there's always a mob, with pitchforks and flaming torches and stuff. Yeah. And the Alexandrians were kind of like that. They were very often king makers and king breakers. They were very, very fond of Cleopatra II, but they loathed Potbelly. And at one point, they actually drive him and Cleopatra III and their brood of children out of Alexandria. They go to take shelter on Cyprus. And Cleopatra II rules on her own. We learn that at her 50th birthday, Potbelly sends Cleopatra II a really dreadful present, all wrapped up with a kind of big shiny bow, as it were. She opens this box and she finds inside the dismembered corpse of their son, Memphites. So he had been prepared, Potbelly was prepared to go to this length to hurt somebody. I mean, that's the kind of sociopath that we're dealing with in the figure of Potbelly. And after that, the tide turns, and yes, Potbelly and Cleopatra III find themselves back in Egypt during this very strange period, which lasts a good decade, in which, this kind of tripartite sharing of the throne continues as usual. And they come to a kind of compromise eventually. Cleopatra II now is getting into her 60s. They come to a compromise where Cleopatra II, will be known as Cleopatra the sister, and her daughter, Cleopatra III, will be known as Cleopatra the wife. And this is how they're represented on temple walls and so forth. There's some kind of amnesty which is finally reached in the royal household there.
I'm going to skip to the Cleopatra VII here. You talk about in the book, but between the third and the seventh, these 50 years of seen as Egypt's kind of terminal decline, and I wonder, how much of this time between Cleopatra II and then with her brother and then the third and the daughter, how much of that was maybe a push towards some of that seemingly decline, but I guess we get to Cleopatra VI having, the Cleopatra VII. And you had mentioned this, so I mean, just clear the air for us here.
Yeah.
Because there was some of this, I think there was a film or a show, I don't remember what it was, and people went on and on about, was she really Egyptian? And, and I think there was some debate on who can play her because she was really Greek or something like that.
Yeah, this has been a debate that's been going on for a long time, because it's absolutely true that in the classical evidence, in the Greek and Latin evidence, we have no idea who Cleopatra VII's mother was. She's simply not named at all. And this has led to wild speculations about Cleopatra VII's parentage. So some people have claimed, she was a Persian concubine, or maybe she was an Ethiopian concubine, or anything, okay? So recently, you might remember that Netflix
Yeah.
screened a documentary called Queen Cleopatra. It was a kind
That's
of
right.
drama documentary,
Yeah.
And there they maintained that Cleopatra was black because her mother had black ancestry.
Right.
I can't follow it at all. I can't condone that. I can't endorse it historically at all, because we do know Cleopatra VII's mother. She's Cleopatra VI, and we find her in the Egyptian evidence. She's everywhere in the Egyptian evidence. That's where actually looking at all the evidence becomes very, very important. If we're only looking at one dossier, then of course we're not going to get the full picture. And Cleopatra VI was a Macedonian, Ptolemaic princess, of the same bloodline as everybody else who had come before her. So there is no evidence that Cleopatra VII was black. And if she had been, this is something that her enemies, the Romans, would really have gone for. Okay? Because they criticize her about everything. They draw attention to her otherness, her uniqueness all the time. So if she had been a woman of color, then it would have been picked up by the Romans. Does it matter? Historically, yes, it does matter. In terms of our culture today, does it matter? I think claiming historical figures can be a very empowering thing. So as far as I'm concerned, if the black community wants to claim Cleopatra as theirs, if it empowers them, encourages them, gives them a focal point, let them have Cleopatra. I'm not precious about it in that kind of way. As a historian, I'll try to speak my truth as a cultural, somebody living now and breathing in this society. I can see why Cleopatra and other characters like her from history are claimed in certain ways, for good and for bad. So that I think that's where we stand on that. But yes, we historically we do know that Cleopatra was purely Macedonian Greek in her DNA, nothing else.
Yeah, it was always interesting. Certain things become very animated. And I think it's one of those things where I agree. I think that, you can have, she, maybe ethnically or, in terms of lineage is this Macedonian Greek. But as you were saying earlier, it does sound like at this point she was pretty ensconced within Egypt. And so maybe culturally was very Egyptian, if you will, at this point.
I think that absolutely. I mean, given that she was the only Ptolemy to learn to speak Egyptian, and she played that card really well. So when she would go on her kind of royal tours of Egypt, she would spend a lot of time in the Egyptian heartland in the south, where she would undertake religious ceremonies. We know that she installed the cult of the Bukis bull in near Aswan, for instance, and she was loved by the Egyptian population because of that. And I think she was really devoted to the concept of Egypt. But she's also, you see, an international figure. And Cleopatra, during her own lifetime, was able to morph very easily. So while in Upper Egypt, she showed herself as the new Isis, donning the wig and the crown of feathers and all of this kind of thing. In Alexandria, she was a sophisticated Greek woman. But then when she played herself out to Rome, she could be a Roman matron as well. She was a flexible, changeable personality, and she knew how to do it. So if you think about her great relationships in her life, first with Julius Caesar and then with Mark Antony, the two great Romans who dominate her story. Well, of course, with Julius Caesar, when she first meets him, I mean, first of all, there's a little bit of a show in which she genuinely was unrolled before him in a kind of bed sack, not exactly a carpet. But what attracted Caesar about her, really, was her intellect. I mean, she was a woman of amazing charisma. She's the kind of woman that maybe didn't look particularly beautiful. She wasn't a head-turner in that way, and most ancient commentators agree on that. The myth of her beauty has been added over the generation. But her charisma would have shone through. So I think had she entered into a cocktail party, all heads would have turned towards her anyway, because, she was the witty one. She was, giving the story. She was doing all of that. And Julius Caesar adored her for that. These were an intellectual pairing.
Mm,
just perfect.
mm,
Mark Antony was a completely different kettle of fish. I mean, he was blunt. He was a GI, essentially. He was a squaddy. He was rough. He liked hard drinking. He liked hard whoring. There wasn't a sophisticated bone in Mark Antony's body. And Cleopatra played to that too. When she first went to seduce Antony, she didn't go to him in Tarsus, with an armful of scrolls and say, "Oh, let's do some reading together." She went on this elaborate love boat that she made up for herself. She dressed up as the goddess Venus. She dressed him up as the god Dionysus or Bacchus. They partied all night, and that was their relationship. She used cheap tricks to capture a cheap man, essentially. And some ancient sources say that had Octavian, the Roman who eventually defeated her, had he shown any interest in Cleopatra, then she would have remolded herself to suit him as well. But he was such a cold fish, he didn't give her an opportunity to do that. But that's what is amazing thing about Cleopatra, is the way that she morphs.
mm,
And you can see it in her coinage. If you look at, there are probably about eight different strikings of coins throughout her life. And she goes from this kind of youthful Greek ingenue, simply wearing a ribbon in her hair, in the first one. And the final one we see her, she looks like Mark Antony in drag, actually. She looks masculine. She's got a kind of Roman nose, a Roman wig. She's wearing Roman clothing. And then on the inscription, it reads, Basilissa Cleopatras, and then it says, Queen of Kings. And she calls herself Thea Notaira, the new goddess as well.
mm.
She, throughout her life, she played with her imagery in a way that would astound even the most competent modern PR experts. She was brilliant at it, just brilliant.
Mm. Yeah, she has these relationships, as you mentioned, with Julius Caesar, Mark Antony. She becomes almost more like semi-deity in some ways, and has all of this stuff at the end. And as you're saying, just good PR propaganda of sorts.
Yeah.
And she really does become that like symbol, which I probably think is what makes her sort of everlasting in time of sorts, and why two dudes are talking about her 2,000 years later, right? Right.
Exactly.
So, but I guess all of that, she kills herself.
Yeah.
And well, how do we know that, one? And two, but why? Like, what was it? Was there really, in terms of the, who can know, right? But in terms of the psychology of this here was it all just a show, and she was really, really alone and really depressed internally? And I mean, again, who can know? But what do we think about the reasons for the suicide?
I think part of it might be explained by what she herself had witnessed when she was a younger woman. After Julius Caesar had put down the war that erupted in Alexandria, Cleopatra went to Rome, where she sat as a guest of honor in a kind of bandstand, and she watched a parade of victory, one of these great Roman triumphs. And paraded in front of her in chains was her sister, Arsinoe. And I think, while at the time that really suited Cleopatra, I think over the decades later, it was a scene that came to haunt her. And I think she was terrified of this public humiliation in this kind of way.
Mm.
The other thing was that after the birth of her first son, her son by Julius Caesar, Caesarion, the whole of Cleopatra VII's life was about getting him to be the next pharaoh. She was obsessed with this. I mean, really, we today we want to see her as a femme fatale or an intellectual great or an able queen. I think if we'd asked Cleopatra what matters to you the most, what role matters to you the most, I think she would have said mother. Because everything she did from the time of the birth of that boy was for his safety and for the longevity of Egypt. And at the time of her suicide, she had managed to get Caesarion out of Alexandria, down the Nile, and she was negotiating with Arab tribesmen to get him out of Egypt into Arabia, where he could live to fight another day. Little did she know that the plot went wrong and that Caesarion was found and executed. Or maybe she did know it. And this was the final straw. You know, she never strikes me as a woman who wouldn't go without a fight. And I think she tried in the days after Antony's suicide. I think she tried all ways. You know, she went on hunger strike, for instance, to try to secure the security of her children, of her 3 children by Mark Antony, and Octavian agreed to that, and she came off hunger strike. But ultimately, I think, you know, all was lost, and the fear of being alive and being shamed in this kind of public spectacle was too much for her. Shakespeare puts it so brilliantly in Antony Cleopatra. To see some, she said, I'm afraid of seeing some squeaking Cleopatra buoy my greatness in the posture of a whore. In other words, some little boy in Rome, would masquerade as her in this way. It's incredible. So I think that's the way. That's why she took the way she did. You know, a lot has been written about her form of suicide. You know, the infamous asp bite, and was this the Egyptian cobra, and therefore the figure of kind of a religious figure in Egyptian thought. You know, the cobra, the uraeus, sat on the crowns of every pharaoh and queen. But in fact, the earliest reports we have of Cleopatra's death doesn't mention a snake at all. Nothing at all. Death by poison, most certainly. But the earliest reports from Strabo, for instance, writing just 20 years after her death, recall that she used a hairpin or a comb, and she poisoned the tips of this comb or hairpin, and she'd jammed that into her blood vessels, and that's what carried her off. It's not until Plutarch, some 250 years after Cleopatra's death, that we get the story of the snake and then the double asp and all of this kind of thing. You know, as the legend grows, it became more acceptable and kind of more noble in a way, you know, to die with this instrument of Egyptian symbolism. Sure. The last words that Plutarch writes, you know, in his Life of Antony, is that Octavian comes into the throne room and sees Cleopatra dead there, and he says to Cleopatra's handmaiden Charmian, "Is this well done of your mistress Charmian?" And she says, "Very well done, and fitting for the last in a line of so many great kings." You know, it's a very Plutarchian romantic end to the dynasty. And don't get me wrong, I think many people in antiquity did see the death of Cleopatra as drawing a curtain over a world that would never be again. And I'm always drawn to a particular passage from a work by a Greek historian called Lucian. He wants to write a history of the universe, he says. So he says, okay, well, so what are my parameters? If I write a history of the universe, where should I start? He says, well, obviously, I should start with the Big Bang. You know, I should start with creation. But when should I end my history? And he says, the only fitting place to end a history is with the death of Cleopatra the Egyptian.
Interesting.
Something about that really resonated across history. You know,
yeah,
it was a final point, a final full stop to history.
That's very interesting. So the last question I have for you is, you know, legacy, right? I mean, you know, people will now know there are multiple Cleopatras. They have a history for many hundreds of years, and they live on. And, you know, I think it's very fair to maintain the historical kind of veracity of their life and what they've done. But what is this legacy of the Cleopatras, you know, for Egypt, for the region, and really for the world? What is their living legacy?
I think that there are two things here. First of all, you know, as women, they provide us with a new blueprint for thinking how completely immersive women can be in power, and how they can wield power extremely successfully. Okay? And the second thing, which is absolutely related to that, is about how we do history. So these women, with the exception of Cleopatra VII, have been written out of history because they don't suit the narrative. Able politicians who are women do not fit the narrative that we like to create of history. Right? When they have been talked about at all by historians over the last 100 years, say in the 1930s, Edwin Bevan called the Cleopatras deplorable Hyrcanian tigresses. Others, even more recently, like Gunther Herbel, in his excellent book on the Ptolemaic Empire, has called them, refers to them about their machinations, about their cruelty. There is nothing written of the Cleopatras that any male ruler hasn't done in the past. But male rulers don't get criticized in the same way as women do. So my big thing is this. Why do we criticize the Cleopatras and women like them? What is their crime? Well, their crime is simple. It's simply being women who were able. History hasn't liked those kind of women. And we've got to get over that. We've got to stop and really think, well, yes, there is a place. Absolutely, there is a place for these women in history. The historiography that we've done so far does them a discourtesy. More than that, it does world history a disservice. I remember reading Jack Balsden's 1962 book, Roman Women. This is before really sort of feminist history or even women's history began. And he writes in the preface of that, "My readers must excuse me for turning my attention to this flippery of history," he says. "I wrote it in my spare time, in my leisure hours, as though women's history is not serious history. The serious history is all about the men, the warriors, the generals, the kings. There's an end to that. We can't accept that any longer." But unfortunately, that fallacy still goes on. And that's why, really, I wanted to expose the lives of these very able women in this kind of way to a general readership, just to get people thinking about there are other ways to look at history, there are other sources to explore, and there are other viewpoints that we can take.
Well, I mean, you do a masterful job, of course. I mean, it's really, really essential and really, really important. And as I said at the top, learn so many things, and we need more of that history. We need more of that history of the pushback I hear on this, oddly, is why are we changing history and all these things? I say, no. We're finally getting a more expansive 360 view, well-rounded history of all of the perspectives.
History isn't a fixed.
That's right.
It's like an amoeba. It morphs, it changes, it grows, it expands. And, the more we can appreciate that, the more we can be excited by it. History is a living organism.
I totally agree with you.
And ancient history, more so, I think. I say to my students all the time, ancient history isn't dead. It's an alive subject. It is affecting everything we do today. And I really, really do stand by that. Let's be brave and let's be bold about it.
I fully agree with you. Lloyd, this was too much fun. I really, really enjoyed this and love to have you on again. And so a big thanks and
it's a pleasure.
all the best.
Yeah, anytime. I'd love to come back.
All right, of course.